Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. I'd like to say a warm welcome to everyone for attending this session, which is called Language Crossings, just so you know whether you're in the right place or not. For those of you here in the gazebo at Olive Pink, can I please ask you to silence your mobile devices? Thank you. The Northern Territory Writers' Festival would like to acknowledge the Aranda people as the traditional owners of Mbantua, Alice Springs, the land on which we are meeting and talking here today. My name's Karen Readerer and I'm facilitating this panel today, obviously. To anyone who is joining us via live stream from a satellite venue across the Northern Territory, hello and welcome to you too. We'd love to receive your questions. Please send them in via text message, beginning with your name and location, to 0475 918 400. You can text questions through at any time during the session, and they will be queued up for answer at the end of the session. So the number for texting questions again is 0475 918 400. I'd now like to introduce our impressive lineup of guests, and then I'll be inviting each of them to respond to the theme of the panel to kick off what is sure to be a really fascinating discussion around the crossings of languages through translations. On my left here is Leah Hills. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble with this mic. Leah is a Melbourne-based poet, novelist and translator. Her debut novel, The Beginner's Guide to Living, was shortlisted for the Victorian, Queensland and Western Australian Premier's Literary Awards, and it's been translated into several languages. Other works include her award-winning poetry collection, The Possibility of Flight, and her translation from the French of Marrikilyi, which I might have pronounced wrong.
Very good, very good.
Acclaimed novel, Tom is Dead. Her latest novel, which had its Central Australian launch here this morning, is The Crying Place, and Leah learned Pitjantjatjara as part of her writing process for that novel. Leah has also taught literary and cultural translation at Monash University. And next we have Lizzie Marrikilyi Ellis, who's a Ngangadara educator, interpreter and linguist from the Western Desert. Lizzie's home is Dukala in the Western Desert, and she's currently an Australian Research Council Discovery Indigenous Fellow at the Australian National University in Canberra, where she's working on a project documenting Western Desert speech styles and changing modes of communication across generations.
Can you just bring it down a little bit?
Maybe that would help.
Yeah. Speak into the middle.
Thank you for the coaching.
My pleasure.
Lizzie's recently published memoir is Pictures from My Memory, my story as a Ngangadara woman. And among her festival appearances, you might have been lucky enough to experience her beautiful sand storytelling, which is another form of translation, which was here on Friday night. Next to Lizzie, I'm getting so many helpers, it's fabulous, is Agostina Swibble, who's an Indonesian travel writer, photographer and translator of Chinese descent, currently living in Jakarta. The question of identity dominated his earlier life, which created his unique perspective in seeing the world around him. His years of undertaking an overland journey brought him to Afghanistan and Central Asian republics, and he's a polyglot, although he's asked me not to tell you how many languages he speaks. His third book, Zero, pioneered a new genre in Indonesian travel literature, and it'll soon be made into a movie. One of the strands of Agustinus's literary work is translating books from Chinese to Indonesian, and currently he's writing on nationalism in the Malay archipelago. And bringing the publishing perspective to the panel is Terri-ann White, who has spent her working life around books and ideas as a bookseller, writer, teacher, workshop presenter, editor, festival organiser, and now publisher. Quite a formidable list too. Her driving constant is a passion for the unique voice in writing and her evangelical promotion of great books. She's currently director of the University of Western Australia Publishing in Perth And one of the strengths of that publishing company is its list of translated books, which, along with the publication of some very beautiful bilingual Noongar books, she's pursued vigorously and successfully. So language crossings is something that's been very much in evidence in many different and very beautiful ways throughout this festival. And this afternoon we'll be exploring aspects of the poetics, the politics and the publishing of language, guided by this session's programmed topic, which is publishing in standardised languages arguably leads to wider readership, greater connectivity, and perhaps even empathy across cultures and borders. And it poses some questions in the program which I hope we will answer, and we will also be posing some more. What is lost in translation, and what is left of multilingualism? So as I said, I'll begin by inviting each panel member to respond to that topic, and Leah's going to kick off.
Thank you. So I'm sort of the ring-in on European languages today. I'm married to a French-Swiss man, so my entire life is an ongoing process of translation. I used to joke to my students, because I'm an autodidact, that I learnt the language in bed, which is true. I'm not an academic. I've never learnt the language that way. He's actually standing right up the back looking at me there. And I'm a great believer, obviously, as a translator in the value of translation. Some of the work that I've done, for example, with Iwerre Atherre, bringing her to a new readership, translating poets that just were under-recognised in this country, French poets, to bring a richer fabric to the community of poetry writers in this country. And even the work I do in philosophical translation with, for example, with Alain Badiou, who's sort of one of the remaining guard of Jean-Paul Sartre and Deleuze. He's the last living one, and he's a man who's commentating on our life that we're living, even on Trump, which he sort of foresaw that movement. So there's a great richness to come out of the process of translation. But growing up in New Zealand around Maori language, Maori culture, at a very young age I became aware of the politics of language. I was in an academic stream at school, and I asked if I could study Maori, and I was told, no, sorry, you have to do French. That's an academic language. Maori is a non-academic language. Crazy, right? So this is at like 13, I became aware of those sorts of politics and around it. And as a writer, I've been very interested in disappearing languages, or languages that are asleep or are in a state of revivification. So even in my very first novel, which is Hidden in the Attic, as all very first novels like that should be, I met an old man who showed me a very thin collection of poetry written in a very French dialect spoken in a sort of a 15-kilometre radius that was sort of being overwhelmed by the French of Paris that has taken over the country. French is a very colonising language. We need to recognise that. And doing translations of that and incorporating that into the novel. So it's sort of been at the very core of the way that I've approached my work as a writer. But one of the key cases of that was I was researching a novel which was looking at the Cathar religion, which was actually annihilated by the first Inquisition ever on European soil in the 12th and 13th century. And what's kind of fascinating about that is the only actual record we really have of Cathar culture is through the translations of their words in trials that were written down by the inquisitors. So, in one sense, they're annihilating the Occitan language, which I'm very happy to say is in strong revival, and there's over 1 million speakers. But, centuries ago, they tried to annihilate that culture because women had the right of ownership of property. It was a very egalitarian society, and it was basically pulling believers away from the Catholic Church and a lot of their money. And yet we have this window, but a very skewed window, into this culture via this process of translation from the trials. So translation is a very, very fraught world.
Thank you. Lizzie, would you like to respond to that topic and the tensions around it, perhaps?
Translations. I've done many translations for governments and for other organisations, and translation in our languages, and most of our people, the majority of our people, they don't read in our languages. Not all people do, because we've had recent contact to English, and a lot of our children, because in the school system, they're learning to read and write in English, and our high school students, well, they're not learning how to translate in their own language. So for that, and because of that, so you have that happening in the school system, and within the other organisations, within the systems, in communities like health, the councils, youth, what are the other ones? There's quite a few. In community life, there's not a lot of translation going on, and governments and other people don't put a big and important emphasis on us, helping us to help our people become literate in our own language, reading and writing, and carrying that practice on. And I know I was talking to one of the Iwerre interpreters, one of linguists. I've forgotten his name.
David Moore.
David Moore, yeah. He said they've got some students doing translation work at 2 schools here. So those kind of things would be ideal in helping to get the translation of people. Once people become literate and being able to translate simple things, then they can branch out and do poetic poems and all the other writings. So for me, like, translation is very important because that keeps us down in advancing for us as a group of people. Like, I'm talking more about my area, like Ngana area, and I think it would be similar for other groups as well. Like, there's a lot of advancement in many fields, yet we still got a long way to go, because you go into the community and not a lot of people can read and write fluently or even speak fluently in English, the standard Australian English, and they don't read and write in English fluently. So that's, for us, it's a big battle there. And I've worked in the education system where I was an area director with West in the Ngana lands, and I was the first area director with Peter Blackwell for the Ngana area school, and we were responsible for 11 schools where we went around and worked with the principals and teachers. And so during that time we were thinking forward and talked to the elders to say, what are the things that you want the children to learn? And they said, we want them to learn all of these cultural things. And within those cultural things, we embedded strands where literacy is critical. We incorporated in the curriculum for them to be learning to read and write in the language, not only speaking it, but reading it. But at that stage, we didn't have our own Ngana people who trained teachers. But I think we got a few in training at the moment. So we've still got a long way where translation is concerned. And for interpreting and translating and interpreting within Australia, we don't get a lot of money. And everybody knows that, for Aboriginal languages all around Australia. we get the dregs of the money that's get divvied out, and most of the money goes to languages from other languages from overseas languages that are here in Australia. And I'll finish there. Thanks.
Thank you, Lizzie. That's a very good call to action, actually, already. Thank you. Agustinus.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would like to share first my interaction with languages. I'm raised as the third generation Chinese diaspora in Indonesia, and there is so much on the politics of language at that time, because everything connected to China at that time in Indonesia is considered as communism. That's why the Chinese culture, including the Chinese language, was forbidden. So for us as a Chinese diaspora, it was not even allowed to speak Chinese, to learn Chinese. And if you travel from outside Indonesia, if you fill the declaration form, like the one that you fill before coming to Australia, here you are not allowed to bring fruit. In Indonesia, you were not allowed to bring anything with the Chinese characters. And they were really searching for that. So for us at that time, learning Chinese language was like learning, like terrorists learning to make bombs. We had to do it in secret way. So my parents said that language is the tradition, is the identity of the people. So if you lose your language, then you will become nobody. And in our big family, only me who studied Chinese, because Chinese was so hard. And we had to go to the teacher's house, knocking in the certain code that the teachers know this is the student or the police coming to read the Chinese learning center. And then I really wanted to cry because the Chinese concept is totally foreign for us. Like we have so difficult letters, and then every letter is like a drawing, and so it's very difficult to pronounce. And at that time, I didn't want even to continue with the with learning Chinese. But it was my mother who will beat me up if I didn't. I skipped the class. So this is one about the politics, and in Indonesia as well. Maybe it's similar with what Lizzie said. We are very multilingual country. Indonesia is number 2 in the world in the term of the number of languages. We have 740 languages after Papua New Guinea, which have 820 languages. And the national language is Indonesian, which is based on Malay. And Malay is spoken as a first language of not more than 7% of the population. So in fact, it's the people who speak Indonesian as their first language is the minority in the country. And we learn Indonesian in the school, and then we said that we are taught that we study this language, we take this language as our national language because this language is egalitaire and everybody is equal in Indonesian, while the biggest number of the language based on the number of speakers is Javanese in the place where I came from, and we study Javanese in the school. And Javanese is much more difficult than Indonesian language because there is layer in the language, there is caste. So my eyes and my mother's eyes, the word eyes is totally different. My mother sleeps and I sleep, the word sleep is totally different. So you learn one language, it seems that you learn 3 languages at the same time. Every word has the layer of respected person, equal person, and the lower person. So you, in the grammar of Javanese language, you don't only learn about the words, you also learn about to measure what is the position of the person you are talking to, whether he is higher than you, equal to you, or lower to you. The words are totally different. So there is caste in the language. And luckily, this is not our national language. But we use this on daily use. And why I'm telling you this? Because every language has their own characteristic. So when I speak Javanese, there are so many things that I can express only in Javanese that I can express in Chinese. And there are so many things that you can express only in Indonesian, and you cannot find the equal words in Javanese, for example. So at the end, I know that learning language is not only learning about communicating, but also learning the way of thinking. When you learn Chinese, you have everything standardized. You learn the culture of the Chinese people who are very much into standard. The concept of standard is very strong among Chinese. You cannot even pronounce "a" as "a" because it's totally different meaning. So they're very precise on everything. But then when you learn Javanese, for example, everything is in the passive sentence. Almost, we don't use so much of the active sentence. It also shows the character of the Javanese that like to hide the subject. They prefer more on the object, and then the subject is not important. So it's more kind of putting yourself lower, and then it's humility in Javanese. So when I travel around the countries as a travel writer, it's not only important to know, to get stories of the people, but I also have to learn about the philosophy of the people, the way of the people thinking, and that's why I also learn the languages, because there are so much of the languages that we can learn. And that's why I learned some of the Central Asian languages and also South Asian languages. The other thing I would like to tell you, because of this characteristic of languages, when I translate my book from Indonesian to English, it's not direct translation. I cannot translate it word by word or even sentence by sentence. In fact, this book has to be rewritten, totally rewritten for English translation. So it took me another 2 years. Maybe later we can discuss why it needs to be rewritten. But yeah, to conclude, every language has its characteristics, so this is what we have to respect in every language. Thank you.
Thank you for that high-speed introduction. Terri-ann, would you like to offer
Thank
a
you.
publishing perspective?
So when I started in the current job that I'm in 2006 as a publisher, I was very keen to build a list of Australian books. And so maybe I'll just talk about fiction at the beginning. I was very interested in building this list of Australian books that may have a really good company of international books. And I went for 5 years to the Frankfurt Book Fair, and I bought books that probably nobody else really wanted to buy because they were either too difficult or they weren't French or German. And so I bought the rights for Australia to these books that really nobody else was after. Dutch, Danish, Norwegian, Spanish from Mexico, Mandarin and Hindi. And I built that, I think, this great company on our fiction list. The one book that I'd want to highlight is a book of 3 novellas by a very celebrated Hindi writer, Uday Prakash. That actually didn't come from Frankfurt Book Fair, but I just cold called his translator at the University of Chicago. That book is only his 2nd translation into English, and I've managed to sell it back to India and to the US and the UK. And it's one of the books that I'm most proud of. Another blockage here is that publishers, no matter whether they're looking at novels, English or into translation, are less interested in short stories and novellas. And so, there's another blockage there. The second thing that I'm most proud of in the 11 years that I've been publishing is this group. We've now got 4 of these books, and the next 2 are coming out in later this year. And they're books. It's a really interesting story. In the 1930s, an ethnographer from the US named Gerhard Laves, very American name, came to the southwest of Australia and did an ethnography of the Noongar people. And he was here for quite some years, and then he went back to the US and gave up being a linguist and became an insurance salesman. And when he died in the 1980s, his family found, I think, between 20 and 30 boxes of an ethnography of the Noongar people of the southwest of Australia. And there are great scenarios for a family clearing out a house and chucking it all in a skip. That didn't happen. They contacted Australia and IATSIS, and the ethnography was repatriated. and it made its way back to Western Australia, and this fantastic group called the Wellerman Language and Stories Project, Wellerman Noongar Language and Stories Project, who are kind of led by Kim Scott, the fiction writer, and he considers this to be the work of his life, began to pull out that ethnography and tease it out in a workshop setting that was long term. A group of people, I'd have to say, not just Noongar people, but they brought in very willingly children's book experts and library experts. So it is absolutely a group that looks at that is inclusive and in a very productive way. And they work very hard on very tough work, because nearly everybody in that workshop group, they're all photographed in the back of all of these books, has just tiny threads of Noongar language. And so this has been a very serious project of language restoration. It's involved them going out onto country a lot and kind of dealing with what has disappeared and the people who have passed away, and the sounds in the ears of the oldest people in the group that were the voices of their parents and their old people. It has made a huge difference to the sense of pride in the group. Wellerman is not a word that you'll find in written Noongar. As Kim Scott writes in his essay at the back, it means curlew-like, and it comes entirely out of oral language. And so deeply proud of these books that are all also illustrated by Noongar artists, sometimes artists who were in Albany Regional Prison, and sometimes not. But in some ways, Kim, because of his reputation in the literary world, could have gone to any number of, the big billion-dollar multinational companies, and they would have published the series, but they would have wanted very schmick illustrations and artwork. And what we've done is made the promise that we want the group to make the decisions about the artwork. So they're bilingual and have a whole lot of fantastic material in them. 5 and 6 are coming out soon, and I couldn't be prouder as a publisher of having this series as part of our work.
Thank you, Terri-ann. I just want to say I was in touch with Terri-ann before this session, and I told her that I cart one of those books around as the finest exemplar of a children's bilingual book that I've ever seen to come out of Australia. So I do highly commend that series.
Can I just say one thing? They are children's books, but we're very keen that they are for children and adults. And sometimes I get twitchy in bookshops when they're only in the children's section, because they're as valuable for adults, I think, as well. But
yes,
thank you.
That is very true, and I'm bringing my perspective as a children's publisher to that, so I will step out of that. Thank you. We've touched on so many different aspects already. Can we speak a little bit, perhaps, to the art of translating and what that involves? Who sets the agenda? What comes out of a particular choices that you make, and what are some of those choices, conceptually, also when you're trying to convey what might be some very different cultural concepts. Would anyone like to respond? Leah, would you like to take us off there?
Sure. Yeah, because I used to teach at Monash a master's course in literary and cultural translation. So a huge part of that was conveying to the students, that it's not just a transcription of word to word, but there's a whole sort of world view that you're trying to capture, and something that might work really well in one culture just seems really wacky in another. For example, the French are incredibly surrealistic. They have a long history of that in their art and their writing, and if you translate a scene in the same sort of surreal nature into English, it just sounds almost like fantasy, whereas they're quite happy to sort of read social realism with a whole lot of surrealism thrown in on top of it. So you have to be very aware of those sort of cultural differences, even when you're doing literary translation. We also used to teach, it was more my colleague who taught anthropological translation as well, which is another whole other element, thinking about the time when something was written, and do you want to translate it in a way that is true to that time and the language of that time, or do you want to have a contemporary rendition of that story? So, for example, a colleague of mine was asked to do a whole new series of Zola translations, and very often the publisher will bring an entire sort of agenda to that translation. If they're going to market it, they're going to say, for example, this is a totally contemporary rendition of Zola that you've never read before, and that'll be part of their marketing ploy. So, and in my own work, for example, with Marrikilyi, the story was set in the Blue Mountains and in Tasmania. So there was a decision made that it would be an Australian translation, and then the other publishers who bought it would have to deal with this Australian translation. So you're telling the same story, and yes, you are translating those words there, but when you make a choice, you think about, the kind of argot, the kind of slang that you're going to incorporate, or the choice of word is going to give it a certain feel to it that feels Australian as opposed to, say, English or American. So yeah, these choices constantly come into that process, and that's before we even get onto poetry translation, which of course is about the hardest possible form, but I'll pass on to other members of the group.
Looking at narratives, when people are telling traditional stories and sand stories and using all the aspects or features of storytelling that goes into it, how do you represent that in a written form? So how do you represent reduplication? When I do the translations of a story, when reduplication occurs, do you do the word we walked and walked and walked and walked, or do you say we walked for a very long hours, for a very long time? So what's that? That's duration. So duration is done with reduplication of the word, and there's another way of when in storytelling you go so the elongation of the vowel also is a duration. So different aspects or features of storytelling, you have to have a certain, you have to understand, you have to be knowledgeable in English to be able to say we walked for such a long time, instead of saying we walked and walked and walked and walked, because that's the way we speak in our language. So there are many other features of narrative features, like there's sounds. We call them, we haven't heard of we call them at the moment sound symbolisms, or yummy sounds. So they're clicks, and when you're telling story, So all these sounds and clicks that you the storyteller use, how do you incorporate that in the story and make the story delicious and yummy for the listener or for the children? So there are lots of other aspects to storytelling, and that we still got a long way to how we incorporate it into. That's my work at ANU. That's what I'm doing. So, and working at how to. At the moment, I'm just doing it as it is for doing. For the duration, went, but will work as you flip it on its side into English. That's when you don't say I went and went. We went. So you have to use all these other words. So that's just some bits to translation. That's not even going into like idioms, metaphors, euphemisms, and all the other bits. And in our language, we have we don't have the to be verbs, which is are, is, am. So we use sitting, standing, lying, crouching. So everything takes a stand in space, like trees, everybody. So it's tricky in every language of translation because of all these grammatical things, semantic things that make it extra harder. So you have to be a linguist. Not only be a linguist, but have to be fluent in your own language as well as the other language to be able to do a fantastic job of translation.
And then
Thanks.
some people are brilliant poets on the top of that.
Yes.
And some people are not.
Lizzie fortunately is.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Agustinus, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I'm doing some projects now of translating the Chinese literary works to Indonesian language. It's quite shame because both China and Indonesia share so many of similar cultures, but because of the cut of this Chinese-speaking generation, so it's very rare that you can find Chinese Indonesian translator, because either someone speaks Chinese very well, which usually they live from the 1960s, then their Indonesian is not so good. And for the younger generation like me, it's very rare that you can find Chinese Indonesian speaking Chinese properly and understanding Chinese. So the problem is usually when we translate Asian books from to be published in Indonesia, we usually use the third language like English. So Chinese, Japanese, Korean books, before they coming to Indonesia, usually they are translated first to English and then becoming translated to Indonesian. So there are so much of the Asian flavor disappeared because there are so many things that in Asian, the way of Asian expressing things is different. And if you see a Chinese book translated to Indonesia from English, you will feel that it's written by J.K. Rowling or something, because of the tone is different, the way of speaking is different. The most significant way of Asian speaking, we don't speak complete. We often don't speak a sentence completely. We usually mask the subject or the predicate, and it gives a space for the readers to guess some of the meaning. So. In Chinese, and I found it's quite similar to Indonesian, the more it's confusing, the more readers like it, because readers like something that they can ponder deeper and deeper. So many words are very internalization. So there are so many words of expressing feelings, which doesn't work in English, but it works so much in Asian literary. So Eastern Asian literary, I cannot generalize the whole Asia. So there are many works from Chinese when become translated first to English, many of this flavor disappeared. So when it came to Indonesian, all of this disappeared. But then if we do direct translation from from Chinese to Indonesian, I could still keep all of these incomplete sentences. And there are also some of the cultural wise that is very sensible for the Chinese, very sensible for the Indonesian, but maybe not sensible for the English. For example, from the books that I translated from Iwerre. Iwerre is a very famous novelist in China. There is a very detailed explanation about koto. When a parent asks the children to give koto, to respect them, the children would kneel and then put the head, knock the head on the floor until it bleeds. Well, for the English readers, maybe this can be considered as domestic violence. But in Indonesian, we understand, or even we don't do that, but we understand, okay, this happened. And I saw in the English translation, the whole part of koto is cut off because it may distort the idea of what kind of parents is that, because the parent is the protagonist. I found like 2 pages were cut off from the English translation. And I retained that in Indonesian. And then the same way, there are some parts that doesn't exist in Chinese because, okay, for us it's already simple. We already understand. You don't need to elaborate too much. But the writers is asked by the English translator to add more things to make the English flow smooth. But for in Indonesian, we also don't need that. So there are so many things between culture to culture. And somehow it's easier and it's more natural if you translate from a culture that is closer, for example, from Chinese to Indonesian rather than from English to Indonesian or from Chinese to English to Indonesian. So I think there are so many influences in the translation. Thank you.
Terri-ann, can I just say, given all the subtleties that the rest of the panel have shared about their experiences of translating, as a publisher, how do you assess if something is what you might consider a good translation? What do you look for?
It's terrifying. It's completely terrifying. You have to find really good, trustworthy assistance, because it's. I once commissioned a large piece of text, and this is before I became a publisher, but I was making something to go to a performing arts market in Indonesia, so translation from English to Indonesian. And the people who did the work charged me a lot of money and had a very good reputation, but it was crap. It was a terrible translation, which we had to scrap and start again because we got somebody to look at it. And it was, we always have to keep in mind this idea of human error, but also in a session yesterday, a young woman was talking about history and how you learn certain things about Australian history in certain books and at school, and they're completely wrong, but you only found out about that a long way down the track. It's the same thing with translations, and the Gerhard Leves example is that this Wellerman group has found all sorts of inconsistencies in the ethnography from the 1930s, as you'd expect. The guy worked for 10 years, and got some things, but then other things in a kind of commonsensical way of people having heard their parents. They can dispute, and they have, and they've made corrections. But we're all prone to error. Maybe it's the late night, working too late or drinking too much or whatever. But, we have to be so vigilant to ensure that we don't have to make that many adjustments down the track.
Yes, the integrity and trickery of language.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, are very challenging.
And can I just make a comment there? As a writer, when you're translating, you've got to be very aware of your own voice as well, and that doesn't take over, and it's a real sort of dance between you and that other writer, because when I was teaching some of the students, and they weren't really writers, but they were trying to learn to do literary translation, and I said, you have to really work out what your voice is as a writer before you can become a good translator, and you need to learn all the skills of, if you want to be a poetry translator, you actually need to be a poet. They say, do I need to be a poet? And I go, well, sorry, yes, you actually do. I wouldn't take it on. It's not fair otherwise, Or at least work in collaboration with a poet in your own language, in the language that you're translating towards. But yeah, it's a real dance, and you have to be very aware of your own voice and your own agendas as a writer and your own ego and things like that. And yeah, it's a difficult dance.
Thank you. I feel like we could continue this discussion for a very long time, but it's already question time, according to my watch, at any rate.
Okay.
So I'd like to open that up to the audience, including our streaming audience. If there are any questions, either for particular members of the panel or for the panel as a whole, Danny will dash about with a microphone.
Hello. For the whole panel, I'm interested listening to all that, and to continue on Leah's point at the end. Even though economically it doesn't make much sense, wouldn't it be logical to translate from Chinese with a Chinese linguist who has a good knowledge of Indonesian and an Indonesian linguist who's got a good knowledge of Chinese, and working together you can do a perfect job? Is that ever done?
Yeah. We usually do that for the translation, and this is a special thing now happening in China and Indonesia, that both countries are realizing their emerging status in the global world. So China and Indonesia has, both of them have a very huge investment in translating their work to other languages. So we call it this translation funding program. And yes, economical wise for publisher, it doesn't make money, but from the government subsidy, it's quite a lot. So in fact, I earn more money now as a translator than as an author in Indonesia by writing the Chinese book, because of the subsidy of the Chinese government. And what we do now is usually like the system, mostly when you have the translator from the native speaker of the target language, you also have an editor who keeps checking the flow and the correctness, the precision of the translation from the language of the origin. So both of them get subsidy from the government with this translation funding program. Yeah, thank you.
Hello. I wanted to ask Lizzie if she has any kind of ideas or thoughts about people living on remote communities in this part of the world, in I guess pushing that cause of learning literacy in their own language. My experience of remote community is small, but it involves children leaving community when they're 12. So I'm wondering how that works. The community that I was in did actually have in their primary school a teacher or a principal who's been there for 11 years and is fluent in the language, and the children are being taught in language as well as in English. But what happens then when they go to boarding school? How does that? How do you keep that going? Other than the wonderful ideal world where all the remote communities could have access to secondary education close to home.
Well, like I said in my opening address, we haven't got much happening in the area of translation, getting money to teach our young people to learn about translation, to speak the language fluently, and to keep our languages strong. Not all communities, but there are other communities that are doing really well. They've got translation works happening in the school system, but from my area, we need more, like in Central Australia. Panya Ina and Linda, we need more assistance, like government need to give more support to Aboriginal languages for interpreting, translation, and not only for courts but for all the services.
Are there any other questions? Because otherwise we'll... Oh, did you have
Thank you. It's a great panel to hear. And a question particularly to Lizzie. I loved hearing you talk about the story, making the story delicious and yummy with clicks, and I heard that we heard that when you did that amazing Jupiter sand drawing. Is there somewhere before your ARC work comes out a good text summary of those different aspects of storytelling that make up a narrative? Just plain English one for someone who's not a linguist or a language speaker.
Oh, I haven't worked on that as yet. Haven't documented all that yet. Still working on it. Veronica might know. Have you written one, Veronica?
Well, I think it's pretty difficult to, translate different language, like especially Aboriginal languages, into English, because, there's no words to explain what you're trying to get across in, stories, and that. I can sort of talk about one of the books that was done in English, all in English, and they expected the actual language to be sort of written in there somehow by reading the English text. It doesn't work like that. It loses the actual value of the language.
Yep. The yumminess. The value,
The value of the language is lost, and it doesn't even make sense to the person that told the story. If you want to get Aboriginal languages, you ask them to tell it to you in their own languages, and then you work on it by translating it from the Aboriginal language to English, rather than from English to an Aboriginal language, because it loses all the value of what people are trying to put across in their stories and stuff like that. I've done a lot of translation in my time, and it's pretty difficult because, English just doesn't work with Aboriginal languages.
Who don't know, that's Veronica Dobson, who's a senior Aranda woman and a linguist and language educator here. Someone else? One more question? Behind me.
Behind you. Hi. Lizzie, this one's another one for you. I know that you taught Nanadara in Paris. And I'm just wondering if that little moment gave you a sense of the difference between English and French and Aboriginal languages, whether was it easier to do stuff in French? Were there...
Oh no, it was hard. I found French hard. I tried to learn it, and I can speak Nanadara with a French accent.
Can you give us a demo?
My name is Lizzie.
I think on that great note of laughter, we're going to have to close the session. I'd like to thank very much Leah Hills, Lizzie Marrikilyi Ellis, Agostina Swibble, Terri-ann White for this afternoon's session. Wonderful. Please give them a round of applause. And thank you also to our live streamed audience. The final festival session here is in the gazebo in 15 minutes, so it's a pretty quick turnaround. That will be Homecomings, Memoir and Landscapes with writer and artist Kim Mahood, who'll discuss her latest book, Position Doubtful, Mapping Landscapes and Memories, along with our guest Agostinus Wibowo, who'll be staying in situ here to talk more in depth about his latest book, Zero, when the journey takes you home.